Alrighty, today we're talking with Jake Friefeld, who's the director of Lincoln Studies at University of Illinois Springfield. And again, as with every episode, we are asking one basic question to ponder on. Um, this year is the 160th anniversary of the events of 1865, and three major events that happened in 1865 also have a very direct Illinois connection. Of course, in February 1st, 1865, Illinois was the first state to ratify the 13th Amendment. Um, then, following in April, was General Grant accepting the surrender from General Lee and the surrender of the Army of Virginia, that effectively is considered the beginning of the end of the Civil War, and took the controversial step of paroling the entire Army of Virginia rather than taking them in as prisoners of war, hanging leaders, such as things like that happened back then. And then, of course, just a few days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So, looking at those three major history making events that on their own would be the biggest event of the year if they just happened on their own, with the hindsight of 2020 and being able to look back with 160 years of, past history lens and seeing how things turned out, which do you feel was probably the biggest event that's still affecting us 160 years later?
Um, well, I mean, pardon my blurred background. I just moved offices, so I'm
Hmm.
I'm a mess over here. I'm a wash in boxes. But yeah, so I think yeah, again, all those events are huge events at the time. And I think I would have to say the one that's still affecting us years later the most is the ratification of the 13th Amendment, right?
Hmm.
It creates possibility for folks who had previously been enslaved, um, grants them freedom beyond what the Emancipation Proclamation had done, and creates all these possibilities after the war. Now, if you'd have asked someone in 1865, that would be really interesting. Ask someone in
Yeah.
1865 what they thought the most important of these was. They'd probably depend on the person. So I think they're all tied up together as well,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
In the Lincoln world, I talked to a lot of Lincoln people who are really interested in the assassination. Which for me, I like. I'm I don't really like the assassination. Isn't the interesting part of Lincoln for me? It's his life and
Hmm.
Lincoln's ideas. But the thing people that often gets lost in sort of the hunt after the assassination is that Lincoln's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a white supremacist, because he gives a speech where he's talking about giving Black Americans, men, in the speech he says the ones who fought and the very intelligent, um, the right to vote.
Hmm.
And right, that relates directly to this idea of Black citizenship. Um, and so I think that relate. I mean, I don't think you have the Lincoln assassination, at least in that way, without the
Hmm.
13th
The amendment.
Amendment idea of the likelihood of Black citizenship and Black voting rights. So I think it's got to be the 13th Amendment. And a lot of my work deals with Black Americans in their lives after the 13th Amendment, particularly going west.
Hmm.
Um, and it's not just freedom, right? It's the ability that people have been sold away from their families. It's the ability to connect back with your families.
Hmm.
You're reuniting, think of the emotional power of reuniting with someone you've been sold away from. One person I studied
Hmm.
um, leaves the South, reunites with a son he's been sold away from, and they're like his two sons, they're half brothers, end up meeting and
Uh-huh.
move west together to claim land. Um, through the Homestead Act as American citizens, right? They go from owner owned to landowners. And
Hmm.
when they fill out their application, they're asked, "Are you a citizen of the United States?" And they can say yes, which has
Yeah, it's huge.
been mind blowing for them. Yeah, so it's got to be the 13th Amendment, I think. Though tied up with the Lincoln assassination. Um, and I mean, the Lincoln assassination has a large effect on how the post 13th Amendment world is going to go, right? Because you do have these paroled Southerners on the ground.
Hmm. And I always think of, that big what if Lincoln had been assassinated. because then you get into the 14th and the 15th Amendments, and those being passed under Andrew Johnson's administration as opposed to being passed under a Lincoln administration. I mean, those are vastly different amendments in practicality and in, you know, on the ground as far as enforcement goes.
Oh yeah, and Lincoln, yeah, and that's the thing about Lincoln too, right? One of the keys to understanding Lincoln is understanding his commitment to the rule of law.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think Lincoln would look at the attacks on black rights on the ground as something that would need to be intervened in. Again, these are right anti-historical
the
questions. Like what would have happened in Lincoln after the assassination? And I
the
think,
counterfactuals.
but Lincoln, yeah, Lincoln's commitment to the rule of law is something that's consistent, a thread you can draw throughout his life. So,
Hmm.
I mean, I think yeah, he had that commitment to black voting rights. The second, Lincoln didn't mention anything without having thought about it a lot first, and it's like, and Lincoln the lawyer, and Lincoln the coalition builder knows that. Well, you get them to accept the folks who have served in the army, and then you push through universal black male suffrage.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think to me the thing that so many people I think forget about when the 13th Amendment comes, which leads to the 14th and the 15th Amendment, all those post Civil War amendments that all come together, is the 14th not only has the birthright citizenship clause in it, but it also has the due process clause in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is also just a major, major, major changer for African Americans that they can be, equal protection under the law.
Yeah. Equal protection under the law, and it settles that citizenship question, right? And
Hmm.
then, of course, like that's the equal protection is going to be um, undermined through the states, particularly through, I mean, once Jim Crow system is brought in. But I mean, the 13th Amendment gives that core freedom that,
Hmm.
and that freedom is not just, again, we think of freedom in the abstract, right? Like, oh, they're not enslaved, they're free. It also gives the freedom of movement, which was denied to black
Hmm.
folks in slavery, which allows them to go west like I study, but later on in larger numbers, move north to cities where there are jobs. Also gives them um, the freedom of movement. You've got the freedom to vote. I mean, till massive voter repression, which I mean, right, like, we still deal with that in our
Hmm.
modern context, comes in. So you have the freedom of movement, the freedom of vote, the freedom of education.
Hmm.
There, some people I've studied show up in the North, and they bear brands on their body from when they were punished for trying to learn to read when under slavery. So it's
Hmm.
these freedoms that echo into the next generation. I think that it makes the 13th Amendment such the powerful thing that happens in,
Yeah,
in
yeah. It's really the thing that you still echoing with today that, and still, like you said, there's things that we're still dealing with, the freedom of
Mhm.
education, freedom of movement, freedom of voter rights. That's all stuff that, we are still grappling with in a lot of issues today that, you know, unfortunately didn't get wrapped up in a nice little neat bowl with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But
Right, yeah. Reconstruction ended in 1877 rather than 1977. So,
mhm,
um, I'm interested about the other conversations you've had on this question.
mhm.
Has anyone said that the grant paroles was the
I've had
thing?
I've had
Action.
I've had one. I've had one said the grants per rolls was one, and likened it to if harsher punishments may have been, dealt out, and then, you know, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, different, Alexander Stevens, different political figures had been arrested, possibly been, tried and sentenced to hangings and such as that. And then Lincoln was assassinated as soon as he was after the surrender. Would Johnson have come in and just blanket pardoned everybody and might have caused a lot of civil unrest with those pardons and an echo of today's January 6 rioters and how the pardons of the January 6 rioters has really resonated with people today.
And Johnson is he's such a slippery guy, right? Like when he
Hmm.
first comes in and right after the assassination, he's sort of irked with Grant about the parole of the Southern soldiers, and particularly um, letting off, I mean, Robert E. Lee.
Yeah.
And where does a general get off making this decision, which is a
Hmm.
political decision? And Grant's position is, well, I made the decision that would get that army out of the field as quickly as possible. I
Hmm.
lost a lot more men had he not made that decision. And I think Grant's also looking back to his experience. I mean, well, he's looking back to his experience earlier in the war too, right? So at Fort Donelson, so he's known as the unconditional surrender, right? But at
Hmm.
Fort Donelson, he does let the Confederate soldiers he captures keep their, I think, baggage and their sidearms.
Hmm.
They captured, and I think at Vicksburg, um, yeah, he paroles all 30,000 of those Confederate troops. So he's, I think, building on that. Um, but he's also building. He had all these guys had experience, or a lot of these guys had experience in the Mexican American War,
Hmm.
and I think at Veracruz, Zachary Taylor just allows the Mexican army to leave with their sidearms and their weapons and evacuate the city, which made Polk angry at the time. But there's this military tradition. Grant's been around, and it's
Hmm.
also the quickest way he thinks to get Robert E. Lee out of the field. But Lee, I think in that those articles of surrender, Lee does put in. I think because it was Lee's choice, I think, to put in that they could go home until they were paroled,
Hmm.
because like his Grant didn't put that in because Grant's like, oh, this is the beginning of the end of the war. Where Lee's like, yeah, but there were still armies in the field, so maybe this
Yeah.
war continues if those
Exactly.
armies.
Yeah.
It's, because we think of Appomattox as the end of the war, but
Yeah.
this is a chaotic time, right? We just talked these three things happening in 1865,
Hmm.
a wild year. Like, it's oh yeah, of course, the war's over at Appomattox. But people weren't saying
No.
that. Like,
No.
oh yeah, this looks like the beginning of the end of the war, but there are armies still out there.
Yeah, Joe Johnston's army was still out there fighting against Sherman in Carolinas. So, it wasn't just
Mhm.
we pardoned everybody. I mean, they were just pardoning just the Army of Northern Virginia. So there were still thousands of people out there still fighting out in the field. And it kind of set that precedent then for all the other surrenders, for Sherman's surrender, what he, imposed on Joe Johnson, and even further out west into Texas and different places. So then, you see that kind of, it's the start of the end, but depending on how Grant handles that, Lee knows that, okay, I can surrender, but Joe Johnson's still out there. So if we don't like the terms, he can still keep going.
It's wild to think about people consuming, right? Like the 13th Amendment, the institution that started the slavery that started this war is,
Hmm.
and then the surrender of Lee's army, and then like that's huge news. But then the terms are either making you angry or saying, "Oh, that's a good idea. That's magnanimous by Grant."
Hmm.
And then Lincoln's assassinated shortly after. It's imagine like living in that time. I think
Yeah.
we live in tumultuous times. So
Yeah.
try to keep myself two news breaks a day. But
Exactly. Yeah, it's one of
60.
those, at some point you just say, I would like to not live in a historical moment for a while. That'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
And, I can't, just imagining just your everyday person living in 1865. I mean, they had to have been sitting there going, okay, what is happening now? Every time I pick up the newspaper, it's something else.
Yeah, and in that time, I think you get a bunch of different answers on which one of these things is the major event. But I think
Hmm.
the 13th Amendment, because it's really seals that new birth of freedom Lincoln was talking about in the Gettysburg Address. It
Hmm.
seals ends the cause of the war, and just gives this new birth of freedom to millions of people. I think that's got to be the one.
Gotta be the one. So, all right. Well, thanks for talking to us today, Jake, and we'll talk to you soon.
I go clean my office.
Yeah, definitely.